So let me share with you some of my ideas about data as the basis of evidence. I can go very briefly about the introduction about my person, because Daniela already summarized it perfectly. So what she doesn't know is that I came to GESIS already in 2002. That was long before she finished her degrees. So it's been a long while that I'm at GESIS, and as Annelies mentioned, by that time it was called Zuma. And I came there very naively from my psychology training. I did my PhD in psychology beforehand. I did a short postdoc year, some postdoc years before. Then I came to GESIS. And so I came there being a psychologist, and in psychology, you have a very different approach to data. And I don't know how many of you are psychologists by training, and probably not in my at my age, but in when I was doing my training, we learned that you need to collect your own data. Very important, because only then you can be sure about the data, about its quality, if you assess it by yourself. And as a small anecdote, I was looking for a referee for my habilitation, and I asked a very well-known and a bit elder colleague to function as a referee, and he looked at my papers by that time, and by that time I spent already a couple of years at GESIS, and by that using secondary data, and he said, well, I don't think that this is enough for a habilitation. You did not collect your own data. And without doing a big study by yourself, you are not qualified for a habilitation. So I did my habilitation with other referees, and they found it that was that the work was well enough. But this only to give you the mentality in psychology by that time. And this assessing of your own data, speaking more generally, results in psychology in very small samples. Usually psychologists have samples of 100 or 200 persons, and highly selective samples. So the typical Psych 100 students, so those that are there, that are available, and that you as a lecturer can oblige to participate in your research. And I mean this obliging really literally. Namely, students in psychology need to fulfill 20 or 30 hours of psychological testing to get their degree. Yeah? So they are the typical sample in your survey, in your study. And of course, they are not naive, they are highly selective. Yes, and this is where psychological evidence stems from. Doing your study by yourself also often means that the data is barely documented. Namely, you do it for yourself, you know what variable 0071 is, and that this is the gender variable, and you do not need to label this variable. But if you ever try to reanalyze your own data set after a couple of years, you will notice that you will not really remember that gender is variable 71. And this means that often you cannot really use your data sets for reusage, for your own usage, and also for reusage by others, because then you really need to spend much more time in documentation. Fortunately, times are changing also in psychology at the moment. We had a big reproducibility debate. And there is a big shift towards open science in psychology, even more than in other fields of social science, I would say. And by that, it means that data is shared more and more, that codes are shared, that documentations are shared. So there is a rethinking, and that makes me very optimistic that we get better data in psychology over the next decade. So when I came to GESIS, I became a data scientist, I would say. I learned that there is wonderful data, and that you, on the one hand, you can assess your primary data, as I learned beforehand, but also that you can assess large-scale data. This is what Daniela mentioned, that I was and I am a principal investigator for PIAC in Germany, and I conducted this study for Germany, and I really learned a lot about fielding a study about quality standards, etc. And I learned, and this was even more essential for me, I learned how to use secondary data. So data that is available there for reusage and where you can answer your research questions with. Let me briefly go to these different two approaches. So talking about primary data, there are clear pros for that. So this research then is really fitting to your needs. You can design the study so that it only includes those variables that you want it to include. You can operationalize the construct in the way you want them to be, and you can design the study so that it really is perfectly matching your needs. You know the quality. You sometimes also know the pitfalls or the not quality of your data. So when you know that some study did not work out as it was, and it should have been, this is very helpful in analyzing the data. Because if you see some surprising results, if you see some noise in your data, it helps you to understand this. And also a very important issue, only you have access to the data. It's your data at that time. I also, a small anecdote, I saw colleagues, very well-known colleagues in Germany waiting for the results of a specific wave of the GESIS, the German socioeconomic panel. And there were two research groups not knowing from each other, both analyzing the same question at the same time. One was faster than the other and got it to a very good journal and got it published. And the other research group could just throw away the manuscript. So it is really helpful if you have, if you are the only one to have access, you don't have to compete with regard to your research questions with others. On the other hand, it is time consuming. You need to assess the data, you need to design your study, and often you first need to get funding for the study, so you need to write a proposal first of all, so it can take you years to get the data. And if you are on a PhD track, etc., it is really time consuming, and then there is also the risk of failure. Perhaps the results are not fitting to your idea, to your hypothesis, they are not supporting them. And so then it really questions your whole study, and the papers are not as publishable as they should be. And so it can become really complicated. So these are the pros and cons of primary data assessment. And just to give you a brief example, what I did during the last years, we did several studies. My focus is on questionnaire development, and we developed several short-scale measures, for example, to assess locus of control. And here we designed the scale, we pre-tested the scale, we assessed it in a first study to investigate the psychometric properties, then we revised the scale accordingly, and finally we validated it, and then we could publish the paper. So there are numerous steps to get to the data that you can then use to analyze and to publish. On the other hand, you have secondary data, and there are clear pros. You have usually large-scale data, so you have much bigger sample sizes. Often this data, so the typical data sets I'm talking about, are often high-quality data, and that really brings you in the better journals. I'm just about to publish a paper and I have to admit it was really fast written paper, but the reviewers were really enthusiastic about the high quality of our sample of our data. And this really brings you a big step to the publication of your papers if you have good data. And of course, you need no time for the assessment, so it is much more economic and efficient. What are the cons? Well, you need to first to find this available data, that there is data fitting your needs out there. Then you need to understand the data. It needs to be well documented so that you can understand it. And you need to process it to your needs. And this is sometimes really complicated, talking about panel data, talking about matching of different data sets. It really can become really burdensome to really to get the data in that format so that you can analyze it. Sometimes the quality is unknown. Also here, a small anecdote. I analyzed data of the International Social Survey Program, and I did an international comparison. And I found differences between the countries. I did not really know if these differences are true score differences, or is they due to differences in the translation. Because the translation did not follow the highest quality standards by that time. And so if you find differences, you really need, you really cannot sometimes have trouble to say what is really the reason for it, and that you should be hesitating not to over interpret your results. And a big issue is that the design is often not directly matching your research questions. Yeah, these studies were not made to answer your personal research question usually, but you need to make your research question fit to this design. And so I really learned over the last 20 years to adapt my research questions to the available data. So to give you two examples of what we did during the last years. On the one hand, we used the NEPS. This is a National Educational Panel Study, which has panels, different population representative samples of different grades in Germany, so from really young kids to adults. And we investigated to what degree personality can predict school grades beyond intelligence. And you can see here the results, namely that the big five, so the personality dimensions explain about double the variance than intelligence in school grades. That was also a very influential paper that we published a couple of years ago. A paper we published only this year was to what degree personality predicts behavioral changes due to COVID-19. And here we used the GESIS panel data, also an existing panel which had an extra wave on COVID. And what we saw is that the personality dimensions of extraversion, so higher levels of extraversion, of agreeableness, and of open-mindedness are related to predictions to changes of your behavior during the crisis. So, for example, doing more hand washing, keeping social distance, etc. Yeah, to finalize what a more kind of a combination of these two forms of data is that you can also produce reusable data. So this is not really the researcher perspective that I had before, but it is more a service perspective. Namely, we at GESIS, we often create high quality data sets. So we assess them, we design them, and we make them available to the research community to use them. So we do not have any prior own research interests. and by that there are no embargoes, but we make data available like the GESIS panel or other researchers like the NEPs, like the GSUB. This is data that is made available for the research community to reuse it, and the success of the study is then really just seen by the usage of the data. So researchers are really invited to use this data, and this is what we do with PIAC. This is a PISA study for adults that we do for the OECD, where we compare the competencies of adults across numerous countries. And we also did that in a longitudinal PIAC study for Germany, where we looked at changes in competencies over time. So my aim was to make you aware of pros and cons of primary and secondary data usage, and also to motivate you to use large-scale data, to reuse it for your own research. Thank you very much for your attention.